Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Followerpodcast. Today, we are still in our series of Saturate, where we've been speaking through the different spheres of society and what it means to follow Jesus in those spheres. And I have a friend of mine, good friend, Buffy Channon. She's going to be speaking to us about her work of following Jesus in the sphere of governance. I actually met Buffy through another friend of mine, Mick Channon, and they are married now. And they live in England, and Buffy works with the government there, particularly at the moment around the issues of Corona. But she'll tell us more about that. Buffy, so good to have you.
So nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. And I know that you are a busy lady, particularly at this time. And so just really appreciate you making the time to speak with us.
Oh, such a pleasure.
Cool, man. So let's jump right into it. Obviously, the people watching here might not know who you are. Maybe some do. Maybe there's a whole bunch of people tuning in from England right now, which is cool. Welcome to the Follow-Podcast. But if you don't know Buffy, give us a little bit of your background. Where did you come from? How did you grow up? What did it mean to grow up in England?
Yeah, so I grew up in England. Until I left for uni, had lived all my life on the same road in a little town, sort of an hour and a half north of London, where not very much happened, but with a very, very normal sort of upbringing, very normal family. I think then left for uni and have lived in London since then. So, yeah.
And Buffy, where did you go to university?
So I did my undergrad in a city called Birmingham, which was a real change. So Bishop Stortford is very sort of conservative, white place, and sort of it hasn't changed very much for a very long time. And I went to university in Birmingham, which is just a really incredible, diverse city in the Midlands. And I studied history and anthropology there, and just had a real hunger to know more about cultures and people. And it was an incredible place to do that. So then after my undergrad, I carried on and went to a university in London called SOAS to study African politics and carry on just thinking. I think, we'll come on to this, but I think at the time I thought that there was a future for me with sort of on the ground charity work. And I think I really felt that real interest in seeing positive change for people, and was just trying to work out what that meant and doing that through further study. So I landed in London then, and I haven't left.
Great, man. And you, when we were chatting earlier, you said one of the formative things of your kind of growing up life, and one of the things that really influenced you, I love this quote, is you said the moments that you realized you're not self-sustaining, and how you can't manage yourself, and that you had to learn to lean on God and learn to be vulnerable within community, and how that process of humbling really shaped a lot of who you are today. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that process?
Yeah, so I became a Christian when I was 15, and kind of, I think it was probably more my teenage angst than a reflection on the local church, but I think I really struggled to see how sort of the Jesus that I'd met, who was so passionate for the vulnerable and the marginalized, I couldn't see him in the church that I saw here. So I spent sort of a few years sort of trying to work out what it meant to follow Jesus by myself. And I think that grew in me this sort of deep sense of independence and like self-sustaining, like the need for that. And actually as the years have gone on, there have been times where it's become so clear that that isn't the way that God designed us, where things have happened that have caused me to need to lean more on God. And I think it's that thing, where I'm weak, he is strong, that actually, like, it's in those moments where we see the need, but also that he places us in community, and the need to like actually sort of step away from the perhaps like the veneer that we put on to other people, and actually just be really real and vulnerable. And I think it's in those times of sort of true vulnerability where you can really meet with God, but also really connect with people. I think that sort of true depth is built in those spaces where actually you're not enough, and you have to recognize that. And I think like it's so humbling to then grow in that, I think, and recognize going into situations that have to be dependent on God, and I have to be open to being vulnerable with other people and learning what that looks like, sort of a healthy vulnerability. I think possibly growing up where I did, sort of the stiff upper lip is the norm, and actually to break that and work out actually what sort of a more godly culture might be for processing difficult things and emotion. And I think, you know, God didn't create us to do things on our own. We were made for family and community. I just think it's a reminder of that, and something that, you know, I definitely still growing in, but hopefully getting better at over time.
Yeah. And you mentioned that sort of stiff upper lip thing, which is, I think, very much tied into British culture. That's been part of what I've experienced. And it's just always interesting to me how friendship with Jesus pulls all of us out of the cultures in which we were born. You know, like there is no one culture that is without its need for editing, I would say. And so, you know, when we start to step into kingdom culture, God always invites us out of kind of that formation space of where we grew up into something more. And it's just interesting to me that you've experienced that as a pulling out of, I guess, self-sufficiency, independence. I have this together, into the kind of vulnerability that makes community possible. Would you say that's a true reflection?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think that's the beauty of realizing where our citizenship really is, and sort of where we really belong. And I think when we have confidence that we can step out and into that, and I think we're free to sort of really critically look at our own cultures and question, you know, it might be completely morally neutral, but it might be something that is more or less of the kingdom. And I think it's often helpful to step out of your culture or be around people who haven't been immersed in that, to sort of really, really see the water that you're swimming in. Because otherwise I think it can be quite hard to identify. But I think definitely, hopefully, you know, when we're in like Jesus focused communities, those cultural things can be dealt with. Like I really believe that Jesus kind of has a way of unpicking our complexities that we've sort of built up throughout life, in his kindness and in his time, of course, but to sort of all those things that we've carried sort of through life, and the complexities and the pain. I think he has a way of healing and simplifying and restoring for him, and hopefully my stiff upper lip is going in that process as well.
Yeah. And I mean, we've had a lot of conversations just, you know, when we've hung out, about how some of that is really the product of previous eras in your nation and what it meant to adapt, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's just so interesting how when we have this Jesus focus, he brings editing and correction, but also how I would say, like, friendship with Jesus is a safe place to fall apart. You know, it's a safe place to come undone. And you described your friendship with Jesus, I love this, as joining with Jesus in the work for justice, comfort, and freedom. Can you unpack a little bit more of that? I love that.
Yeah, I just think, you know, there's that bit where Jesus reads from the scripture, and he reads the bit from Isaiah about coming, and he's coming to comfort those who mourn and set the captives free. And he sort of reads that bit, and I just think, actually, you know, that's his mandate. And when we see what Jesus is doing, he goes around and he heals the sick, and he comes alongside people who've been cast aside by everybody else. And I think it's our privilege, you know, as people following him, to follow in those footsteps and continue to do that. And I think that's such an adventure. I think it's like really sad when people sort of have this stereotype of Christianity as this like boring, stone building bound sort of religious thing, when actually there is so much excitement to be had in in obedience to what Jesus calls us to, and stepping out and being with people, and actually seeing people set free from addiction, seeing people healed in all kinds of ways, and just seeing what God wants to do. And I think I don't think that gets boring. So I think my walk with Jesus has definitely been sort of a process of learning what that adventure looks like. And I think that it can look quite different in different seasons, and as he's calling people to different things and growing people, but it's never a dull one.
And I agree with you. For me, the following of Jesus is just the craziest roller coaster ride to be on. If you take it seriously, right? It's because Jesus is not happy to just watch the world fall apart. Like, his heart is always to bring restoration and redemption. And so then if those of us who follow him tie our hearts to his, inevitably we're going to be pulled in the directions of that work, And so absolutely, I think it's so true. And for you, following that heart, and this is what I love about you, is that, so you're currently serving in the sphere of governance, which is often, if I'm honest, from the outside in, people would perceive that role as in some ways being disconnected actually from people, kind of almost cordoned off from people around a lot of bureaucracy and red tape. And yet you are this person who has this massive heart for people, to be connected, to have vulnerability, to share in community. And that heart has led you to governance. So I'm wondering if you can just unpack a little bit for us that journey and how that worked.
Yeah, so I think that my heart was always to want to sort of see things improve for people, to create spaces so that people can empower themselves to see the change. But and I think when I was in uni, as I said, like, I kind of thought that would be predominantly something that I would do in the third sector. But then I worked for an organisation for a little while, and we were doing really amazing projects with people on the ground. And I think I just felt really heavy-hearted towards the end of my time with them, because I realised that although the work that we had done was really profound in the lives of people that we had met, and the relationships we had built were so beautiful, but the sort of structural injustice that was making people vulnerable in the beginning was still going to be there. So as soon as sort of money for these projects ran out, people would be basically back where they were, and generations after them would be as well. And I think I just felt really compelled that I wanted to see the structures change, that structural violence come to an end, that actually people would have the ability to see different things that they wouldn't be stuck in these places. So I think so I moved from sort of on the ground stuff, and then I stayed in the third sector and was working in a policy and advocacy role, which I really, really enjoyed, and it did feel sort of a step in the right direction. I started doing some research alongside it as well, and again really just thought it was really useful to get that insight. But then when it came to sort of communicating truth to power, it felt slightly like shouting into the void, because I didn't understand sort of the structures of government, the levers of change, really. And so I guess the next step was to dive into the belly of the beast and work out how that worked. So this is my third role within government, and just trying to understand how things work, how change happens, sort of what needs to happen to see improvement for people and see things change. So I think, but for me, I think there is always a tension there between the policy side and then actually, which is sort of a little bit more cerebral. You've got to sort of have your thinking cap on, and not losing sort of the soft heart, and not losing that. So I think for me, it's always been really important to maintain having things always sort of doing work on the ground with real people and being involved in people's real lives and being really involved with people that actually your policies might affect, and actually having the balance so you've still got the soft heart but then can sort of really hopefully see some change. So that's sort of for me an important balance to have. It's I don't think it's either or, rather it's both and at the moment that means sort of government and policy work in the day and sort of on the ground stuff in spare time, but maybe in the future sort of the balance of that will shift, and I think there's seasons for both. But I think for me the structural change piece is really important.
Yeah, I think what I appreciate about you, Buffy, in our short time of knowing each other is that you are quite clear about your purpose, and you understand your current work as the vehicle thereof. So for me, whenever we talk, I don't feel like you ever are serving the idol of career in some ways. It really feels to me like your heart is set on kingdom purpose, and you understand that right now the place that the Lord has you in order to live that out is in the sphere of governance, And I think that's such an important distinction to make, is that you are not first and foremost in pursuit of a career. You're a person of the kingdom who understands that you're living out your calling in the current context, I don't know if you would speak maybe a little bit to the tensions of that in your own experience.
Well, firstly, thank you. That's a really kind thing to say. But I think, I think it's been an interesting thing and can bring frustrations. I think my first role in government was far less people focused than anything I'd ever done, but I knew that I was there to be exposed to the type of things that I was being exposed to. I was in a strategy team in the business department, working on legislation, which was super interesting. But I mean, the vast majority of energy policy doesn't have any direct impact on people's lives. And it was just a bit of a weird time. And I think I really grappled with the this is a really good career move, but actually I'm not sure this is where I'm supposed to be. And in my second role, so I then moved. So I really enjoyed the sort of bigger picture piece there, but thought actually a policy role would give me sort of exposure on a different level to see how things happen at a sort of slightly slower pace and more in depth. So I've been working on quality of supported housing. So I don't know if that sort of translates to other people, but supported housing in the UK is housing that's given to people with additional support needs. So that might be anything from sort of people with people who are homeless or experiencing homelessness or have addiction and sort of the short-term crisis moment, people fleeing from domestic abuse, all the way up to sort of long-term support for people with disabilities or old people, and anything sort of in between, really. But it's been amazing to sort of really see what can be done at a structural level that will really affect the lives of people. And I think I guess the tension that you point at is actually for me, it's keeping my eye on the prize. I've known what the purpose is. I really care about people who are vulnerable being made less vulnerable and being given sort of more autonomy and agency to make the decisions that they want to make. And actually, although it's very easy to get distracted by the thing that that's the exciting sort of obvious sort of worldly career trajectory, they're sometimes making choices that sort of prefer the former over the latter. But I think at the moment, for me, that hasn't had to be I haven't had to lose one over the other. It's been more about strategic choices than losing sort of interesting jobs for. But then I think if God's given you a passion for something, then it is interesting and it doesn't feel like you're in the wrong place. So sort of rambly answer to your question, but I think for me it's just keeping my eyes on what God wants me to do, and also, you know, actually when I'm not in that space, I feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
I think
and I see the kingdom value of it in a massive way. You know, as you're speaking, I'm so reminded of Shane Claiborne. I think both of us have read a lot of his work. And he makes this one phrase, quote, statement, which I love, where he says, you know, it's good to give a man a fish. It's good to teach a man to fish. But at some point, you've got to go upstream and figure out who built a wall around the dam, you know, because a lot of the things that impact people's lives are structural, systemically unjust, you know. And your work really kind of goes to the head of that, like is really tackling that at a very core level, which I think is a beautiful thing. And I think is an important work, you know.
Yeah, and I really feel so passionately about that. And I think at the moment we see it so profoundly. I mean, coronavirus has just highlighted in just horrific ways the privilege and the protection of some parts of society over others. The death rates among minority groups in the UK is much higher than the white population, and there are certain groups, other groups as well, that are disproportionately affected. And then even in terms of, you know, as soon as this happened, food bank usage went through the roof, and you think we're in one of the most affluent countries in the world, and the number of people requiring food aid is extraordinary. And actually, you know, what does it mean that we've got this system set up that benefits the very, very few very much, and everybody else is so vulnerable at this point? And so I think I really hope that this is a moment of change where actually there's probably hopefully a little bit of national shame over actually where we are, and there's a bit of readjustment there.
And I think what encourages me in our conversations is, for you, that doesn't only fall sort of institutionally or globally, that falls quite personally. You know, as we were talking about how you are navigating this corona space in your own faith, just as Buffy Channon, just as you as a person. One of the things you said, I love this, you said you have to reassess a lot of stuff. This has kind of woken you up, and you have to reassess a lot of things to make sure that your center of gravity is squarely on Jesus and not on anything else. Tell us a little bit more about that journey for you.
Yeah, so I think this has been a really interesting time because I think compared to the vast majority of people probably in the world, we're in a really privileged position. I think, you know, Mick and I have both still got our jobs. We're both enjoying them. We're sort of safe and we're at home, and there's just a lot that we have. But I think the structures that we're used to in the rest of life have been completely shaken up. You know, we can't go to work, we can't go to church, we can't, you know, the comforts that we're used to, we can't just go out and just see whoever we want. Actually, everything, the privileges and the freedoms that we're really used to are really limited right now. And I think it's very easy in a day-to-day life to really just get a bit comfortable and you know, say the words that you think that like you're reliant on God, and you know you think that you're like committing those things. But actually, when structures are completely shaken up and you lose some of those freedoms completely necessarily, like I completely agree that we should have lost those freedoms, but I think, you know, it's necessary for this time. But I think it's really caused me to reflect both on the privilege that we have, that we're actually completely fine, but also on actually where was I putting my security and my comfort. And actually, I think when we're always sort of lent towards the kingdom and lent towards, we're sort of fixing our eyes on things above, actually when these things shake, it shouldn't be such a shock, but it, you know, it has been. And I think even just sort of grieving with people who are grieving, because I mean families all over losing loved ones, and I think even just sort of the shock of this sort of global moment, I think it's been really interesting for me just to reassess where I'm putting my security. And I think God is kind, that like just because we fail to sort of remember him in that sometimes, that he's not going to sort of withdraw it from us now. So it's not sort of a once or never again kind of situation. It's just sort of remembering that. And I think that can sort of make the rest of things feel a little bit lighter and enable us to then think, what is it that we can do in this moment? Actually, if we, like, given the privilege that we have, what is it that we can do?
Sure.
Because for other people, it will be struggling with the experience now and what God is doing. And so I think it's then freeing us from our own complication, just to go do what needs to be done.
Yeah, I think for me it's been there's been a challenging tension, because on one level I've been made aware of how complicit I am in some of the systems of injustice, and how a lot of my comforts are a product of me siding myself with some systems that are ultimately not just, and I don't think the guilt is necessarily the right response there, because I don't think guilt leads us anywhere. But I do think a question of responsibility comes into the equation as we sit and as we think about this. But then I think that responsibility can move us in one of two directions. One, to a place of a sort of Messiah complex, where we feel now we have to fix everything that's broken in the world, and and the other, which I think for me has been more healthy, is that this spotlight that has been shone into sort of I want to say maybe the deficiencies of my interior world. I don't have another necessary phrase for that. But what that's done is it hasn't pushed me toward greater autonomy. Instead, it's pushed me to greater dependence. It's showing me that, man, God, what I thought it meant to follow you wasn't necessarily wrong, but at best was superficial. And you're starting to show me much deeper expressions of that. But I don't think I can get there without your help, God. And so it's what it's doing for me is it's pulling me to a greater need for prayerfulness, really, and not to the end of some kind of therapeutic anesthetic, but more to the end of a catalytic activating force. To go, Father, if I'm ever going to live into what your imagination for me is, I'm going to need your help to do that. And so then
and I think that really frees people from the sort of the Messiah piece, when you realize that it's actually really not about you or what you can do, but there are still things to do, but doing that from a place of sort of sanctified imagination and humility before God, rather than sort of that I must is actually not that, so
absolutely,
and
I think
there's,
on one level, that introspection is a privilege. Like, some people don't know where their next meal is coming from, so they don't have the ability to self-reflect right now, But I think those of us who do, again, there's this tension, because on one hand, the idea of introspection and personal reflection and all of that, it's a very privileged conversation. But on the other hand, I think those of us who have been given that opportunity in some ways have that responsibility, provided it's unto something greater,
Yeah. And I think with all of these things, I think all of this comes from a place that, like, fully believing that every person is created in the image of God and, like, is dignified. And if the world isn't recognizing the dignity that they're owed through whatever structures, it's totally unacceptable. And I think it's the balance of working with people and creating platforms for their voices to be heard, and then affecting the structural change where you can. I think it is like, and actually I think it's, if you have privilege, it's absolutely important that you broker that to open doors and create spaces for people to speak for seeing the structural change, if you can, on just doing whatever is in your hand. That's your responsibility to do. We're all carrying something, and it's sort of our responsibility to acknowledge the power and the privilege that we hold and broker that for the benefit of others, I think.
Yeah, and so that feeds into sort of how you are navigating this moments in history vocationally in terms of your work. So your governmental work, you're very involved with COVID actually right now.
Yeah, so a lot of people in the British government at the moment have been sort of moved to work on work relating to coronavirus. So I asked to be moved, and I've gone over and I'm working in a team that's working on the response in London. There are sort of teams working on lots of different regions, and I happen to be in London, and it's a real privilege to be there and to be trying to help sort of the operations people join the dots with the policy people. That's kind of the role that I'm fulfilling. I think we work with a lot of partners on the ground with the NHS and ambulance and fire service and lots and lots of groups. And making sure that they're connected appropriately with government and making sure that things happen. And I think it's been amazing to be a part of that work and really seeing issues resolved that will have sort of tangible impact on people right now. I've really enjoyed being part of it. I think I felt a little bit, before I joined this team, I think I felt a little bit helpless. You know, it's lockdown. And what is it that I can do? I mean, there are ways that you can volunteer and there are ways that you can serve locally. There's a lot to be done, and financially giving as well. But actually to be sort of in the centre at the moment, I'm really, really grateful for just the opportunity to help.
Yeah. And you were saying something about how sort of a directing question for you in the midst of that, as a person who's following Jesus in that work, is that you're asking yourself the question, what is the kingdom vision and how do we bring that to bear in this moment, you know? And I just wonder, you know, you're talking about joining these dots between policy and practice, and it would be easy to kind of not be able to see how that is animated by a kingdom vision. So maybe talk to us about that. What does that look like for you?
So I think in the day-to-day at the moment, there's potentially slightly less space for the bigger picture thinking. I think there's so much going on. It's very fast moving. Necessarily things need to be resolved for people as quickly as we can do that. I hope there'll be a moment after this where we take a breath and we can dream for what the next thing can be. We can be hopeful for the next stage and pray for that. And I think I've mentioned the sort of hope that there will be a recognition of the structures that we've sort of relied on that have benefited the few over the many, and sort of an addressing of that. I think I mean, in the UK it's felt really interesting. I think there's been a real shift in the media that we're valuing you know, our key workers and our frontline staff and really like lauding what they're doing instead of celebrity. And we're really valuing very different things. We're valuing sort of the input of scientists and rather than sort of political rhetoric, although of course that carries on. And I think there's been this shift, and I wonder like what government will look like after this if people's tastes have changed and there is space for a bit more of that. But I think for now the work is quite reactive, but I think the piece of work around recovery begins now, and I think there will be a space for dreaming and hoping in that stage, and suggesting sort of things that I think really reflect the kingdom, hopefully. But I think, you know, people keep talking about the new normal, and I sort of don't really enjoy that phrase. But I think the world will look quite different after this, and there will be scope for innovation and creativity in how we build community, in how we serve people, and I think there will be lots of things for sure that we're used to doing, but I think that leaves space for different things, for creativity. And so I think there is a moment coming where we can see that.
Yeah, and I think that's encouraging in two spaces. Number one, we often think that kingdom work has to be this like massive fireworks experience. You got to be raising Lazarus from the dead every day, or you're doing it wrong, kind of thing. And I think what you're describing is a daily faithfulness that trusts that God is at work just through your presence, even in the task at hand. And I think I appreciate that. That's encouraging to me as well, because sometimes I feel like the daily smallness of what I do, or the daily sort of how the daily work of what I do doesn't always feel very supernatural. Sometimes it just feels pragmatic. Sometimes it's just about doing a task. And yet, I think, the encouragement is that if a kingdom person is in a place, then kingdom is being revealed in that place in some way, shape, or form, And so the fact that you are doing it already adds a kingdom element to that space. And so I think that would be the first encouragement that I take away from that is to say that sometimes the missional work in the sphere that God's placed you in, it doesn't always look like fireworks. Sometimes it looks like faithfulness. Sometimes it just looks like your daily obedience and the overflow of your person formed by God in that place. And the second thing that I'm really encouraged by, which would bring us to our sort of final space where we end off here, is, if I'm thinking about a number of people who are in the sphere of governance around the world who are listening to this, man, I can imagine this is a tricky place to be, because it's just not business as usual in a lot of ways. And I think that's true in a lot of spheres. A lot of the people I've spoken to in the business place, arts and creativity, media and communication, the church. I mean, the church is a whole new world right now. Every sphere has this kind of mixed bag of chaos, disruption, and uncertainty, but then at the same time, potential for innovation, new creation, new hope, new future, And I think my heart is to speak to the one without undermining the other. So, my friend Trevor, he said, we don't want to baptize this situation. It's terrible and it's hard and it's difficult. But at the same time, buried in it is this resurrection power of Jesus. He has this ability to bring life. And I think one of the things you said is, if you had to give advice to people in the sphere of governance right now, you would say, don't be afraid to hope, to be hopeful, and maybe just unpack that thought for us.
Yeah, I think it is a dark moment. It feels like a dark moment. And it feels, the UK has bounced from Brexit to COVID. I mean, people are so shocked.
So you guys have had it rough, man.
It's not calm over here. But I just...
I've never I didn't think about that until right now. That's
who's talking about negotiations right now? I think we're in a moment that isn't easy. But I think, specifically to the British context right now, we have a government with a crazy majority who will have like a good few years after this to see things happen. And I would say, like, if you're in the UK right now, like, now's the time for bold ideas, because they have the majority to carry it through. Like, be brave with your ideas, put them forward, hope for bigger things. What's the kingdom vision? Put it forward. And I think, although that is specific for the UK context, given sort of how Parliament looks right now, I think for anybody working in a government space, like, actually, things are shaken up. You can shape how the dust settles.
Wow.
You're in that place.
Say that again. Things are shaken up. You can shape how the dust. If you're a tweeter, you can tweet that. That's a good one. Anyway, carry on going.
And I just think there is a moment, and I think where things are really static, I think it can be hard to create that sort of friction to see things happen. Often, if things are really comfortable, but they're not right now, there is no risk that anybody's comfortable. Things will have to change. So I think we're in a moment for that dreaming, for that hoping, and then for being audacious. Just go for it. And I think, if you had said a year ago, we'll be in a world in a year's time where all the planes are grounded, where everybody stays at home, when no one goes to work, well, very few people go to work, you wouldn't have believed it. And I think that there is this sort of suspended disbelief that we're sort of living in this space, and actually I think that will create space for things to change. And so I think be hopeful, even in this horrible time. Do what you can, serve how you can, but I hope that there'll be good things that come from this.
And I think, to kind of wrap up our thought here, the thread I see in our conversation is that there is this interchange between deep formational spirituality for those of us who follow Jesus, and then a prophetic imagination that leads to activation. You use the word a sanctified imagination. Love that. This idea of as we spend time with Jesus, we start to get a picture of how he would run the world, right? And then, for this particular conversation, those of us who are in the governance sphere, man, is now not the time to take a risk, to try and see that world actualized in some way. If the Lord has entrusted
and nothing will sound too ridiculous.
Yeah.
Because the world we're living in is wild.
Yeah. And so if there was ever time for policy reform, structural innovation, like systematic overhaul, like if ever there was a time when perhaps there was a window of opportunity to sneak something through for the kingdom, like maybe it's now, and so maybe instead of, and I would say this is true in terms of what I've been hearing from people in every sphere, maybe this is not the time for self-preservation. Maybe at this moment in history, God's calling us to actually stretch out and to step into some big, bold things, which could be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, tell you what, I know this is going to, maybe this is too far, but I think if you have the privilege to step back and say, is this a moment for me to self-preserve? I'd say the answer is no. Like, if you know where your next meals are coming from, like, it's time to step out and do something, because actually that's not the case for so many.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Yeah. And Buffy, before we go, any sort of closing thoughts, any stuff you would want to leave people with in this area?
I said I went into the belly of the beast to learn, and I think what I've learned is that it's just people. And I think people, getting to know people, and it's not impenetrable. And I think, if you're a person in the third sector working on the ground, if you're a policy person, whatever you feel that your calling is, if you want to have your voice heard, there are ways in. I think I'd recommend doing some digging and finding out who the right people are to talk to, but actually, it's very possible to have your voice heard. So I think I would say that that there's hope for change, and if you have something to say, make it heard.
Yeah, so good. I love that. Regardless of where you serve Jesus, the simple work is really the same: love God and love people. And you may have different tools in your toolbox because you're in a different space. Stuff about policy that I will probably never understand in my whole life. I'm quite sure of that. But regardless of where we find ourselves, our work is kind of the same: love God and love people well. And then that works its way out, and that is how the kingdom of God comes in the earth as it is in heaven.
Yeah, hey, Buffy, I would also say that, just a quick caveat. I know that I felt called into governance and structural change, but I've met just wildly godly, amazing people who felt like actually Jesus did stuff on the ground, and actually their role will always be to do the stuff on the ground with people and leave the structural stuff to God. And I think it's the most valid, to be called to follow what you feel God's call is on you. So it doesn't, I'm not saying that this is only the right way.
Of course, yeah. It reminds me of that conversation. Actually, I've forgotten who it is now. I think it's Peter. and Paul. And one of the disciples comes to Jesus and says, well, how come he gets this, that, and the next thing? And then Jesus says to him, like, what concern of it is it of yours, And you do what I've called you to do, and let him do what I've called him to do. And I think sometimes that is the challenge in the kingdom, is that we can get so caught up in this comparison game, when in reality, obedience is success. And so my hope, though, is that for those people who do feel called into that governmental space where their work looks like what you're talking about, I would imagine that can sometimes be quite an isolating space and maybe a difficult place to really follow Jesus, And I'm hoping that as they listen into your story and some of the thoughts that you're sharing, number one, they would realize that they're not alone in that space in terms of understanding their work as ministry. But number two, they would hopefully get some insights and perspectives that would help them live that into reality, Yeah.
Great.
So thank you so much for being on the Follow Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it's been really good. And for everybody else, this is the last conversation in our Saturate series, and I hope that it's helped you. We've gone through the spheres of education, the spheres of church, business, family, governance, media and communication, creativity, and the arts, and we've had really good conversations around all these things. And the hope really is that these conversations have in some way been catalytic for you. And so if they have been, I just encourage you to get hold of me. I'd love to, as the Spirit leads, see if there can't be communities that start to develop around this stuff. People starting to have conversations and dreaming together and seeing what it could look like for us to have God's imagination in the places where He's put us. And so if that's something that stirs in you and something you'd like to be a part of, then get hold of me. You can do that through the website, mattlewis.co.za. And I'd love to have that conversation. The next series coming to the Follow Podcast will be one called Mountains Bow Down. Something quite different, actually. It's reflections of my journey through Nepal. So I hope that'll be helpful to you guys. And Buffy, thanks so much. And we'll chat soon, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And for the rest of you, we'll see you on the next episode of the Follow Podcast. Hey friends, how you doing? Thanks for watching the video. Before you go, I wanted to ask you to do one more thing. Well, really 3 more things. But before I do, let me tell you why. This over here is you. These dots. Well, really, it's all of us. And this over here, that's the internet. We live in a time which is unlike any in history, really, where we can be connected across the world quickly without even knowing each other. You're watching this video and some of you have never even met me. But one of my convictions is that if the internet matters at all, it has to be about more than just likes, shares, and follows, right? It's got to be about a purpose and a reason. And for me, that reason is community and connection, because whatever we are going to do on this planet, we're going to do it together. So I've been thinking about how do we take this and funnel it down, turn it into that, right? So places of mass first contact into places of community and connection. I'm not really sure how to do that in the big frame, other than to say that I think it starts with steps of connection. So moving past just watching something to actually being involved in something. And so that's why I want to ask you to do 3 things. Number 1, follow this channel and subscribe. Turn on the notifications so you know when the videos are uploaded. That way you can stay connected to what we're doing. Number 2, go to the Instagram account, mattlewis516, because there we put up prayer videos and other material that takes you a little bit deeper into the community where you can slowly become a part of what we're building. Number 3, go to the website, mattlewis.co.za. There you can subscribe to get our quarterly newsletter where you see where we've been and what we're doing and how you can get involved. And you can also get first dibs and new information on events that we're hosting when we can start gathering again together. So those 3 things, the YouTube channel, Instagram, and the website, these are ways that I think we can move from places of first contact toward community and then together toward building the story that God is calling us to write. Thanks so much, guys. Hope to see you soon.